Welcome to Writer, a program for and about writers sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm your host, Bob Gentry, and today we're fortunate to have with us Ed Falco. Ed, there are so many accomplishments here. I need to read those and summarize them for the audience. Ed has published stories, poems, prose poems, essays, book reviews, and one play. His books include Concert in the Park, Of Culture, a chapbook of prose poems, Winter in Florida, a novel, Plato at Scratch Daniels, a collection of short stories, and his play is Home Delivery. He has a novel in progress, A Dream with Demons. Ed's work has appeared in notable publications such as the Atlantic Monthly, the Gettysburg Review, the Georgia Review, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. His awards include a Pushcart Prize Special Mention for one of his short stories, the Hampton-Sydney Playwriting Award for Home Delivery, the play, the St. Andrews Review's Mishima Prize for Innovative Fiction. He is currently an Associate Professor of English at Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Welcome, Ed, to Florida Junior College at Jacksonville. We talked before the program about some questions, and one of the reviewers has said of your stories, Ed Falco's stories are gifts of revelation. And we have your main book of stories here, Plato at Scratch Daniels and Other Stories. Could you comment on that, Ed? Gifts of revelation.
Well, Alan Wire said that my stories were gifts of revelation. I think in part it's good blurb prose, but maybe there is some truth to it in that every good short story moves toward a revelation of some kind. Joyce called them epiphanies. There are different ways of saying what a short story does, but when I've got a short story that's going well, I hope that the things that are happening, the characters that are created and the events they find themselves in lead them to a significant moment. And if it works for the reader, that significant moment, with any luck, feels like a revelation. It's not as if I start out though and say, I want to reveal something, or I want a revelation to happen. I create the characters and the situations, and my own involvement in the story leads things to happen, but I'm sort of following them too, so that when they do happen, the revelation is as much a revelation to me as it is to the reader.
Can you give us an example, Ed, from Plato at Scratch Daniels? I've read a number of the stories in recent days, and I am struck with the revelation theme in a few particular stories. For example, the story Gifts, I think, and others.
Yeah, Gifts is a story of mine that people tend to comment on and say. When the book first came out, somebody wrote me from the Library of Congress saying, I just read this story and I wanted to write and tell you. It's a story about loss, and the main character in the story comes to a revelation at the end of it. The revelation for him being that life is about things in time. And if you had asked me again at the beginning of the story, was that where I was going with it? No, I was trying to write a story about loss and about an older character coming to grips with loss, and that's what happens at the end of the story. You know.
Yeah, the main protagonist, his son has died, and on the son's deathbed, he says, "My gift to you is death." And then, as the main character watches his house burn down, he gets this feeling that you're talking about, this
everything
revelation.
Changes in time. Everything passes in time.
Right.
So in writing the story, I had created a situation in which the young man owned a cabin, and the cabin was on a piece of land that was eroding away. Mm-hmm. And the reason the father wound up there is because his house, he had a fire, and so he wound up. And those things came together. The house on fire, the cabin on the edge of this kind of eroded piece of land that was wearing away, with the loss of the son. And they all built toward this notion that that's what life is about things in time, about things passing through time, nothing staying the same.
The father sort of learns to go with the flow of time, even though it means life, gifts of life, and the gift of death is the other side of the coin, perhaps.
There's that Wallace Stevens line, "Death is the mother of beauty."
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that's in my mind, I guess, with this.
I sense a kind of Far Eastern view of things there, kind of a Buddhist flow, go with the flow. That
Well, I
did
came
you
of
have-
age in the '60s, you know. So,
Yeah, right.
So that was the Eastern sort of Eastern high-mindedness, it was called for a while.
Right.
I don't have any formal background in Eastern religion, but I mean, I've read some. It might be there as an influence.
Another reviewer says spiritual damage is the subject here in Ed's stories. And I see quite a bit of spiritual damage in stories like Sir Thomas More at In the Hall of Languages. I love that title. And Peace Brother, and Plato at Scratch Daniels, the title story there. Can you kind of go into that a little bit?
The characters I'm writing about are often dealing with wounds of some kind, of pain of some kind. And that comes out of a dynamic mix of what the short story is and what, as a writer, I bring to the short story. The short story, it seems to me, is about characters at a significant moment in their life, a point when something's about to change, or something is about to happen. So when I'm imagining a character, I'm imagining a character who is needy, who needs something, and that requirement of the short story, that I create a character who has a need that's going to be fulfilled, plays together with my own sense of what it is within people that creates this need. And I guess that might lead to a notion of spiritual damage. I don't know precisely what spiritual damage is referred to there, but need.
You know, Joe, the central character in Peace Brother, seems to be quite spiritually damaged. He is trying to get out of the Vietnam War, but in doing so, he carries on a kind of moral charade, it seems like, and this is measured against his father, who, well, you tell us.
Well, I tell you what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the way the 60s was so cavalier in its iconoclasm. I mean, I grew up in the 60s among a generation who wanted to tear down everything. And there was good in that. There was good change. There were things that needed to be torn down. But it seemed to me we were also, now from the hindsight of middle age, it seems how incredibly naive we were, how incredibly innocent we were in this notion that everybody could love everything and the world could be a utopia. It was as if we were ignorant of the kind of economic and cultural demands that are required to keep a society coherent. We were so innocent and so naive. And in Peace Brother, there's a story that looks back at that and tries to take the innocence of those characters and juxtapose it with another generation preceding them who had fought in World War II in order to make the kind of culture that they take so for granted. I sound really critical of the 60s now, and part of me is critical of that period. But I'm not entirely critical of it. There was much that needed changing.
Would you say that the draft board psychiatrist in Peace Brother, who knew Joe's father in the Pacific in World War II and commented on implicitly the courage of Joe's father, would you say that's a norm against which Joe, the anti-war person, is measured, or is that going to?
I would say they're both of their generation, and of their time. His father, Joe, the psychiatrist, and the main character's father, they would never have thought about opposing World War II or of not going to fight. It wasn't in their cultural background.
Two different generations.
Two different generations, both of them facing war in a different way. His generation, it was commonplace to think about opposing the war and about not going to fight. So these two characters come up against, they're both of their generation, and they really don't know quite what to make of each other. When I have them speaking together, I try to have them both speaking in the slang of their period. You know, the main character says, says the phrases of the 60s, whereas
groovy man,
groovy, and the other character, the psychiatrist, is speaking in the phrases of his generation, and the story just questions that. It questions it questions the ways in which you're shaped by your culture, and it asks some questions about what the 60s as a period of time.
We were talking about before the program about some key figures that crop up in your stories, like St. Augustine appears atop Money Tower, and in fact that's the paraphrase of a title, St. Augustine on Money Tower. Then in Peace Brother, we have right in the middle of the story just a look back at Joe's experience as an acolyte in his Catholic upbringing. And then we have Sir Thomas More, another Catholic figure in Sir Thomas More and the Hall of Languages. So I'm just seeing Catholic images and figures all over the place, and they often, in fact, I don't see any situation where they're not good. They're not standards by which our world perhaps has fallen. So am I looking at a Catholic writer in Ed Falco?
You're looking at somebody with a strong Catholic upbringing. I've never thought of myself as a Catholic writer, but I was raised in the Catholic Church. I was an altar boy as a young man. All of the imagery of the Catholic Church I'm imbued with it, so that it comes out, no doubt, in my writing. The St. Augustine, Sir Thomas More, those are thinkers who imagined an ideal or a perfect world. St. Augustine's City of God, Sir Thomas More's Utopia, and then Plato's Republic is also in there, and Plato at Scratch Daniels. And what I was trying to do, and what I thought about in those stories, was an effort to compare the kind of ideals we establish. The mind is capable of thinking, this is how the world can be perfect. This is what an ideal world is. And to contrast that with the world we actually live in. So St. Augustine on Money Tower has St. Augustine in a dream vision preaching to the city of Syracuse while he's being listened to by Strand, a contemporary man whose life is in strands, who's lost his son to drugs. Probably, though it's a dream, you're never really sure.
Not sure whether the son has committed suicide or not.
Right, but it's suggested in the dream. It's a dreamy. It's one of the most unusual stories in the collection. But Saint Augustine is that dreamer of perfection with his City of God. Sir Thomas More in Utopia. Generally, Utopia is considered to be a kind of. There's a kind of popular notion that Utopia is a book envisioning a perfect world here on Earth.
That's sort of ironic.
As I understand Utopia, it's really an ironic.
It's an ironic
book
view of
that Utopia can't exist here on Earth. That the perfect world is on another plane.
As I think Elyse says.
She asks him. She recognizes that.
Right.
She says, "But isn't he being ironic in the story?" So it brings out the theme that I'm working with. And then, of course, they fall into their sinful act at the end of the story, the contemporary world that they live in, juxtaposed with Sir Thomas More's high idealistic sort of thoughts about what it can be perfection. And then Plato, of course, in the Republic with his vision of a perfect world.
Right. And then the mentally troubled patient at the mental hospital in Plato at Scratch Daniels, whom the central character Danny had served with in Italy during the war. And I really enjoyed that story. It sort of entitles the whole collection, and Plato's influence on Catholicism.
Right.
You said you'd never been asked whether you're a Catholic writer or not, but there, I think some case could be made for that.
Yeah, I think so too. And again, I think it comes from where my background is and where my childhood education is, and growing up in listening to sermons every Sunday and the gospel every Sunday, and being influenced by priests and by Catholicism and by the ceremony of the church, which I miss immensely. I've never found a way to replace.
In the many of the people of the 60s, I'm a little bit older than that generation, but they are in positions of power now, and many of them are pushing things like multiculturalism, diversity, and these are all good things. However, there is a movement in the multicultural area that is anti sort of anti-Western civilization. I was reading some criticism recently that lambasted Faulkner as a defender of the male principle and so forth. Are you kind of, as a product of the 60s now, that as an associate professor of English and as a widely published writer, coming out of the 60s liberal tradition, finding it kind of lacking in many ways, yet good in some ways? The question I'm getting at, do we have a kind of conflict here between traditional Western civilization in your writings, perhaps, or in society, and this multicultural emphasis that often takes away from Western civilization?
I think certainly in the world of the university that's in conflict, and I think it's a good thing in that it throws into foment established ways of it throws into into chaos the established ways of looking at things. So it questions things in a good way. Do I agree with the more progressive elements who really want to throw out literature entirely and no longer teach literature because it's only one strand of cultural conversation and we might as well be teaching cartoons? Do I agree with that? No, not really. I think it's a good thing in that it makes us all fight. You know, when somebody comes into the faculty room and says, I don't want to teach literature anymore, we shouldn't teach literature anymore, it's just a bastion of white male patriarchal authority.
Is a cliche.
Right. Yeah, and when we hear that, and then if you're going to defend it, you have to say, well, what am I defending? What is it that I want to keep? Do I really believe in a sort of system of beliefs as propagated by one segment of a culture that was white and male, or is there something else in the work that's worth defending, that's true?
I guess what I'm asking you, coming out of these stories, is this a kind of defense of the best of Western civilization?
I think in these stories, I'm looking at what I understand to be ideal notions of what a culture can be. And then asking, why are these characters in the kind of fragmented, spiritually void kind of places where some of them are? What is the difference between our contemporary fragmentation, our lack of community, our lack of integration as a culture with what once was? And I'm old enough, I wasn't around in the 40s, but I'm old enough to remember the world of World War II, America, when we were still as a nation, a community. I mean, I think there are arguments made that we've never been really a national community since World War II. That after that we began becoming more fragmented, we become different blocks and groups of people, till in 1990, we're a nation, yes, but the kind of cultural community, the core of all of us being one, is not what it was before. So I'm looking back and saying, the world seemed a lot more integrated then than it does now.
Yeah, I was a child growing up during World War II, and I can remember that the unity, and as you say, since then, as you get into the 50s, late 50s, and certainly in the 60s, and then from then on, we've had more and more fragmentation.
That's the kind of question that I think I'm asking. What happened? As a young man, I wanted everything to be changed. I wanted everything to be different, but I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea the kind of community I was tearing apart, and I had no idea what I had to offer in replacement for it, except for some vague notion of we should all love each other, which is, unfortunately, it's a beautiful sentiment, but it doesn't work in the real world.
It's kind of interesting to compare Joe, who's pretty empty in many ways in Peace Brother, with, I believe it's the character, the son in Gifts. His name is it Howard?
Yeah, Howard.
Howard, who has this I love everybody idea, but in death he reaches this profound notion of giving the gift of death to the Father. And I see a nice contrast between Howard, at least his profundity toward the end of his life, and Joe.
Yeah, I think, Howard is a representation of a character of the good side of that whole philosophical kind of way of looking at that idealistic way. I mean, that's one of the themes that keeps coming up and going on in this story, the contrast between ideals and the day-to-day reality of things. Right. And Howard's ideal, near death, it seems to me, he comes to a moment of recognizing that this is the way things are. We live in time, and time, it passes, and it's a gift because, again, going back to the Wallace Stevens line, death is the mother of beauty. Because things exist in time, because they are transitory, they are beautiful and precious. Right. And he comes to that recognition. The
images of fire also impress me in a number of your stories. In Peace Brother, the church is burning, and then but in the middle of the story, we have this look back at St. Francis, where Joe was an altar boy and so forth. At the end of the story, we have this nice touch of the Joe looking out at the rubble of the fire and not having the moral impetus or to go out and caution children that might get hurt.
They're playing in the ashes of the burned church.
Playing in the ashes, yeah.
Imagistically, I hope that suggests the theme of the story, which is that at that point we're burning down a culture and playing in the ashes without any idea of the danger that might be there.
In just a few minutes left, Ed, and it seemed like this has really gone fast. Faulkner mentioned the task of the writer is to write about the human heart in conflict with itself, to write about the eternal verities of love and sacrifice and compassion. What would you say the task of the writer, both the story writer and the poet and playwright, is today?
It makes me wish I were half as eloquent as Faulkner. I could come up with a good answer. I don't really write with a notion of what my responsibility is as a writer, and I think that might be a cultural change also. Faulkner wrote with the notion that he was going to be read and thought about. I write with the recognition that most people are not going to read me, that I'm going to have a very small and very limited audience. I have no illusion. I love the notion of perhaps my work lasting and perhaps it changing an individual or influencing an individual. But the notion of it, of the writer having a task within the culture, is too grandiose for me. Just because culture has changed so much. If I were making movies, I might think that. I could make a movie that would really change things or influence things. But my short stories and poems are going to be read by small numbers of people. And I write out of a need to write for myself. And then I hope something good happens from it. But I need to be down there writing. Right. That's my task, to keep myself healthy by writing.
Well, this has been very interesting. My guest today has been Ed Falco, Associate Professor of English at Virginia Polytechnic Institute in Blacksburg, Virginia. Ed has been talking about mainly his stories, which we found insightful. This has been Writer to Writer, and I'm your host, Bob Gentry of Florida Community College at Jacksonville.